Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Lighthouse. Written by Soren, Narnia. Performed here by Jason Hill. My name is Alaric Tell. On November 5th of last year, I attended a dinner party with some fellow historians from Hofstra University and returned to my home just before 11 p.m. My small farmhouse, deep in the countryside, was covered in winter wrens. Hundreds of them, watching me silently. That was how I knew that my enemy was issuing a call to combat. A call I was obliged by tradition to obey. At the age of 57, I was fortunate to have lived long enough to be ready. I looked fondly at the house I dwelled and studied in for a decade, and drove away from it without going inside. The wrens, upon seeing me leave, flew up into the night sky en masse, having played their part, unknowingly delivering a message that they could not comprehend. I drove 84 miles to a small private estate in Nyack. I parked my car in front of a tasteful but long-abandoned house set on 7 acres of woodland. I took an electric lantern from the trunk of the car and walked around to the back of the property, and then down the grassy slope to a tiny strip of beach, bracing myself against the cold wind. 2 rowboats were tied to a very short pier, tapping against each other as they bobbed up and down. I carefully climbed into one of them and unhooked the rope that held it in place. It was approximately a 45-minute journey to my family's island across Little Peconic Bay. I had to stop rowing several times to warm my hands and my ears however I could. The silhouette of the aged lighthouse where I would do battle became visible against the stars halfway there. It was taller than I remembered. I had not seen it since I was a child of 12, and my father had told me of its significance late on the day after Christmas, as we stood on our little beach, looking off toward the island I was now visiting for the first time in my life. Once a year or so, as an adult, I came to the estate merely to ensure that the house, grounds, and most importantly, those 2 rowboats were being maintained. Sometimes I would look toward the island in an attempt to see the place where my life would likely end, but not often. The lighthouse stood a few hundred yards off the beach, where I dragged the rowboat onto the sand. A rough, poorly demarcated path led over some scrubland that became more and more dense as I walked it. When I reached the lighthouse, I pressed my hand against the cold wood of the front door and pressed inward. No human hand had performed this task for 70 years. Inside, the darkness and silence of a forgotten pharaoh's tomb. There was a smell like dead, wet leaves and spoiled wine. The lighthouse had not been operational since 1927. I turned on my lantern and climbed the winding stone stairs to the top of the lighthouse. The only sound I heard was that of the humble waves against the beach, just barely audible. The stairs ended in a small circular room that looked out over the bay through a pair of windows clouded and caked with the remnants of age, though they had never been broken. No one came to this island. Not ever. Those who did approach, adventurous tourists or tipsy boaters curious about these ugly little 12 acres, were invariably haunted by a strange and terrible feeling that an inexplicable danger was here. Many years ago, The Secretary of State of this country landed here while on a solitary sailing excursion that ran into some minor distress. He wrote to a friend later that he had been overwhelmed by a feeling of dread the moment that he set foot on the beach, and upon returning to the comfort of his cabin, found himself inexplicably frightened of rising from his bed for an entire day. Looking through the west window, I saw the tiny shape of that second rowboat drifting across the bay toward the island, navigated by my enemy. He would be arriving soon. I should have been too cold to stand there, waiting for him. Too cold with the ancient stone conducting the chill into my body. But now that I was on the island, I was able to use the white magic to warm myself. I could have stayed there all night, sleeping uncovered on the floor if I had wished it. But, of course, there would be no sleep for either of us. He knocked on the door 20 minutes later. I opened it to see a young man standing there in the darkness. A man of no more than 35 years. I held up the lantern. His hair was cut mercilessly short, and he was clean-shaven. He was quite thin and wore a denim jacket and very dark blue jeans. He announced his name, which was Frosch, and asked for entrance, which of course I granted. His accent suggested he had been raised somewhere in northern Poland, or so I had guessed. He put his hand out to shake mine, and I did so. He followed me up the spiral staircase. He was wearing a knapsack over one shoulder, and in the high room, he set it on the musty stone floor. From it, he produced a bottle of Domaine de la Romanée and said he trusted I had a fine palate. There was also caviar, the finest, he assured me, and crackers and a wedge of cheese, if that was more to my taste. 2 plates and 2 glasses that my enemy informed me had been crafted in Madagascar for a prince. We sat on the floor across from one another, resting our backs against the walls behind us, and ate and drank. And we talked about history, about the vineyard I'd owned and struggled with, about the Napoleonic Wars, about the meals that we had eaten in faraway places. It was quite cordial, as was the custom. The extraordinary wine had no effect on either of us. After our meal, there was still time before the arrival of the final message. And for Frosch, that meant time for games. He clapped his hands once, and we stood. "You first," he invited me, and I nodded and told him to approach the west window. I had nothing prepared and so improvised my trick. "Look at the shoreline," I told him. He knelt briefly to move the lantern to a different spot on the floor so that its feeble glare would not strike the window pane. He looked almost shockingly gaunt in that light, and I realized I was looking at a very sick man. Perhaps this challenge had been made in haste because of it. He looked downward through the window, seeing a distant horizon tinged in red over Long Island, and the sleepy bay that was laid out before us. I began by starting a fire in the sand down there. It rose from nothing, the shivering flames no more than a campfire, 3 feet high, the only speck of light out there on the island. From the delicate waves that lapped the shore, there then rose 7 separate and unique sheets of water, 10 feet apart. First, nothing more than spiral wisps, but cohering into more unusual shapes that were definable even in the darkness. My enemy smiled as he watched them. I let them hover on the waves for a moment, and then brought them slowly together to mold my creation. My eyes closed and I was leaning up against the far wall. The sheets of water that had become arms, legs, a torso, and a head merged, and the man was made. He took his first and last steps on top of the water and walked onto the beach toward the campfire I'd started. He glimmered in the moonlight, 6 feet tall, stronger and bulkier in frame than I had been, even in my robust youth. I made him kneel down before the fire. His face, that of a famous figure from military history, was immediately recognizable to my enemy, who laughed, though his eyes, cruel as any god had ever created, did not laugh. They were incapable of doing so. My waterman raised his arms, and slowly, he leaned forward and tipped over onto the fire. When the water struck it, it was quashed. Nothing remained of him, but a puddle on the beach, fanning outward in many directions, quickly becoming ice. My enemy scratched his chin and complimented me on my trick, and then offered to show me something more vivid. I felt the first spidery caress of fear on my heart. "Come to the window," he said, and I approached. Standing beside him, I felt physically the evil he had brought with him to the lighthouse, to the island, to the earth. Outside, far away, almost a mile perhaps, a lonely sailboat moved across the bay at walking speed toward some distant harbor. Its mast had been lowered. I saw tiny orange lights on its rails. My night vision sharpened more and more, and I saw that the water around the boat was beginning to become choppy. It would do no good to plead for my enemy to stop, so I only watched. He had lightened the sky just enough to make clearer the sight I was about to see. I heard no sound when something broke the surface of the water beside the sailboat, erupting upwards. It was a tentacle. A lashing, slithering thing as thick as a stout oak, and it stretched many yards above the sailboat, suggesting it was attached to something below the water, 10 times its size. The tentacle wrapped itself around the center of the boat and squeezed. The frame buckled, windows shattered. I saw but did not hear wood splinter and snap. Then the tentacle pulled the boat downward into the bay. It tilted crazily on its side, the tentacle still squeezing, crushing, shattering, and I hope that its inhabitants were dead before they saw what had brought them to this moment. The boat vanished beneath the waves in seconds, creating a suction pool behind it, the water bubbling and frothing, and very soon it was gone for good. The bay swallowed it whole, and the water became docile again. My enemy turned to me with an awful smile. Up close, I saw that he possessed one artificial eye, an expensive but still obvious replacement. We agreed to have one more glass of wine. He suggested a toast to life itself. Our glasses clinked. As the Domaine de la Romanée soothed my throat, we heard the wolf outside the door, down below. Unseen, it began to howl, low and steady, the sound winding up the staircase. My enemy froze for just a moment with his glass to his lips, then continued to drink. It was then that his face changed before me, revealing itself for what it truly was. A bottomless, obsidian cavity with pinpricks of blood where a human's eye should have been. Neither his transformation nor the wolf's howling lasted for very long, just long enough for us to hear and honor it. It was time. I asked my enemy what he would have of me, as the host of the battle, and thus obligated to make a sacrifice, give up to the hunger of the far spider. He seemed to consider it briefly, though, of course, he had planned his response. "Your hands," he said, and again I nodded, so that we would be more comfortable in our final moments before what was to come. I created 2 simple wooden chairs for us by imagining them. Frosch dug into his knapsack again. I expected him to draw from it a knife or machete of some sort, but these were modern times after all, and instead he handed me a pair of heavy C-shaped metal boxes that fit easily into my palms. He instructed me on their use. All I needed to do was trigger a small, taut, 1-inch wire that stretched between a small cutout section of each to make them operate. It seemed quite simple. I asked him in a somewhat unsteady voice where he had come across such devices. "Kosovo," he told me. We took our respective chairs. I now sat roughly where my father had in 1943. Just 2 months after returning from Bastogne, and where my grandfather had sat in 1920, and where his brother had sat only 6 years before that. That man, Carl was his name, had been asked to give up his eyes as sacrifice. So, perhaps my own wasn't so terrible. I looked at my enemy calmly by the light of the lantern. He wished me safe travels in the world beyond this one, and I wished him the same. I relaxed and allowed the cold to claim my body once again, and that feeling was so strong in my spine as to be almost pleasurable. I looked up through the east window at the small sliver of moon. I told my enemy that the wolf had returned to its place beside the conqueror, and we were free to do as we must. "Yes," he said, and told me I should proceed. Now. Closing my eyes one last time, I opened my mouth, and tensing my body against the trauma that was coming for me down a black and rotting tunnel, unleashed a deep, throat-ripping shout, hollering from the depths of my pitied soul, craning my head backwards, directing the sound off the cobweb-laden ceiling above me. Holding my hands far outward from my body as I had been instructed, I depressed the wires in both explosive devices. My hands were there 1 second, gone the next, as a thrumming crack echoed in the circular chamber and the device exploded. Shrieking pain snaked up both my arms and into the center of my chest, pulling and tearing at my heart from either side of my body. I sensed my enemy moving across from me as every bit of magic I held within flowed outwards and over him in a venomous wave of power. I opened my eyes to see him being lifted upwards out of the chair, his feet rising off the floor, his entire body rising vertically before me. 3 feet off the stone, then 5, he levitated and stared hatefully down at me. And I believe now that it was salt water pouring out of his eyes. Salt water running down the front of his collared black shirt. Then those eyes became grotesquely enlarged in their sockets as light pulsated behind them. A light of no color. A light possessing such energy coiled behind it that it could have cracked the earth if sent beyond the island. Instead, as Frosch hovered in the air, reaching out toward me with violently trembling arms that appeared to be trapped in the kind of haze within which one sees desert mirages, he spat his own magic at me with the force of nuclear fission. I felt myself being lifted up, and then pushed downward again. A sightless and powerless ragdoll, I struck the floor and then felt my body being propelled into it, into the stone, matter driven impossibly into matter. I felt the stone envelop me, and I could see the ceiling high above as I descended, literally absorbed into the structure of the lighthouse. 6 feet deep, then 10, my molecules swimming in darkness. I felt my body becoming thinner and thinner, till there was only enough flesh on my bones to keep them intact. I caught a glimpse of my enemy staring down at me, and that was when I blacked out. For me, the battle was over seconds after it had begun. The last thing I heard was a roar, half human and half animal, emerging from my enemy as he spent the last parts of himself trying to destroy me with his chaotic and murderous mind. When I awoke, it was daylight. I was on the ground, lying face up. A gray drizzle struck my face. It was dawn, but of which morning I did not know. I was deep in the woods, resting on a natural bed of leaves, surrounded by dying trees and silence. My vision was blurry. My head was pounding. I looked down at my prone, withered body. It had once been the body of a relatively fit man of 57, but I was perhaps 30 pounds lighter than I last remembered myself. Blood had dried on the cuffs of my long-sleeved shirt and spattered all the way up to my shoulders. My hands were gone. For fear of what I might see if I looked too closely, I gazed at the cloudy sky until consciousness left me, which happened with blessed speed. I must have found my way to the nearest road, or perhaps been found by a concerned stranger, for I remember the siren of an ambulance and the image of an Asian woman leaning over me in the back of one. She was frowning, concerned not for the stumps at the ends of my arms, which had been crudely wrapped in gauze to stop the life-threatening blood loss, but for the twisting of the straps that held me taut to the support on which I lay. After the intravenous drips, a darkened hospital room, indistinct voices, I let myself drift in and out of sleep. Day became night. Night became day again, and the cycle repeated. To avoid speaking, I embraced entirely the fog that enveloped me. When I could no longer feign unconsciousness or avoid the questions of the medical staff, I pleaded amnesia. I remembered nothing, I said, of anything that came after the dinner party. That seemed to satisfy them. I told them to refuse all visitors. They released me a day later. I did not particularly listen when they described their rehabilitation process to me, and the options I had for living life with my new handicap. I needed to simply be away from there as soon as possible. An orderly helped me put my clothes on, and I got into a cab outside the hospital. The cab driver, a man from Kenya who had once attended medical school, drove me all the way to the estate after I invited him to take my wallet and my bank card and make a single stop to withdraw as much money as it would take to deliver me to my destination, and then complete one more task for me. We pulled onto the estate well past dark. It was 5 days after I had met my enemy. My driver followed me around toward the back of the house. Once or twice, he had to assist me when I became dizzy. I had not eaten for several hours and nearly passed out. When he asked me if I lived in this grand house, I told him no one had for 30 years. There were other rowboats, older and more decrepit, housed in the horse stable on the most forested side of the property. Unfortunately, I was not able to help the driver in dragging one down to the shore. We climbed in, and he manned the oars. It was even colder than it had been 5 nights before, but he complained not at all. I was certainly paying him enough not to do so. Like me, he had to stop rowing every 5 minutes to warm his hands and his ears. When the rowboat bumped against the shore of the island, I bade him wait for the fire I felt myself just strong enough to create. He seemed confused at the sudden appearance of this fire nearby, but walked off towards it after asking me if I was going to be able to make it to wherever I was going. I knew he would be more confused still when he saw that the fire's foundation was only sand, but I cared little. Cradling a lantern in the crook of my right elbow, I staggered through the brush and scrub toward the lighthouse, which stood dark as ever. I pushed the front door inward. As I did, I looked to my left, sensing a presence nearby. There, in the tattered undergrowth, beside a withered tree, stood a gray wolf. It looked at me emptily, with neither respect nor contempt, only a vacuous animal curiosity. The wolf, the island's only permanent resident, hundreds of years old, watched me enter the lighthouse. I made my way with great difficulty up the winding stone staircase, gently touching the insect-infested wooden handrails built by my great-great-grandfather, the most powerful warlock in all of North America. There was more illumination in here than before. The moon was full and bright. I could not steady myself with my hands, and so the going was quite slow. 5 steps from the top of the staircase, my foot kicked something, and there was an echoing clink. I saw by the light of the lantern the empty bottle of wine that I had shared with my enemy. What was it doing here? I wondered. And I stayed where I was for a long moment, knowing that magic was not the only way I could be killed. I listened for some tiny whispers of sound that might tell me Frosch was still somewhere above or behind me in the dark, waiting to stab me to death or cut my throat. There was a thin, reedy whistling sound coming from high above me. It was the wind, seeping through a shattered window up there. The longer I stood, waiting for Frosch to appear, the more frightened I became, and so I moved on. I reached the top of the staircase and looked into the circular room. Leaves skittered across the floor, having blown in through gaping holes in the glass all around. I could only see clearly between breaths, for the frosty air that emerged from my mouth clouded my vision. However, there was nothing here to remember save for the thing that now defaced the center of the room. A crude, new feature that will not be seen by any man until the night my son comes to the lighthouse. Hopefully, after having lived a full and happy life. But not so old as to have lost too much of his considerable powers, and cast the pale glow of his lantern across the lonely enclosure. The mummified body of my enemy was partially embedded in the floor, withered and shrunk by half as if the work of 1,000 years had worn him to a fragment of what he'd once been. Like the indistinct ghosts of Pompeii, he had been entombed in stone, knees fused to the floor as he crawled plaintively toward the window, one arm outstretched, as if reaching it would have saved him somehow. There was very little detail of his face left, but what was there spoke of a pain few can ever imagine. The man's mouth was open so wide in a silent scream that the very structure of the jaw had mutated. He was not the only man to have become a permanent part of the very structure of the lighthouse. Dozens of seemingly natural flaws, indentations, and bumps in the stone throughout were, actually, upon closer examination, remnants of the fallen. Toward the bottom of the staircase, 30 inches up the wall on the left side, was the shape of a man's foot, wholly embedded and seeming to push out from within. Further up the staircase, on the opposite wall, was what appeared to be the crown of a man's head, enveloped entirely in the blind stone. A mutation in the ceiling above me was, in actuality, the right side of the screaming face of the malevolent African shaman who had challenged my father for supremacy in 1943. The rest of the shaman's body, torn asunder in the battle that took place in this room, was scattered in bits and pieces throughout the walls, as were the bodies of the other evil men who had tried and failed to make my family succumb. Eyes, hands, fingers, bits of body too small to be identified, all were sealed just below the surface of the stone inside this lighthouse where the world was defended from destruction. It served as a grotesque museum of our hollow victories. My son would be the next to fight. An invitation would come in the form of a gathering of silent winter wrens. He would have to leave his family in the small hours, perhaps never to see them again. He would row to the island to face his enemy. It would happen just once in his lifetime. He was now 32 years old. I, myself, need never use the island again, thank God. Soon I'll be dead, but it will not be a violent death. And never will I need to return to the lighthouse and cast eyes through the darkness upon the hideous statue of an evil man who will not be the last to make that little room into a place where unthinkable combat is waged beside a sleepy bay.
Chilling tales for dark nights.